Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I've done some work in the Netherlands where the idea of the non-citizen or the problematic citizen and migrant goes beyond mothers and fathers, but also their children and their children's children. That's not only in policy and the categorization, but in terms of the media as well. I was wondering if you could speak to that in terms of the way that these kind of labels are carried on through generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got a real bugbear with the term second generation migrant because it's such a racialized term. It's like it never applies to white people are rarely considered second generation migrants. So there's a kind of, how can you be a second generation migrant if you've never moved, you know? In fact, people who are in the UK, because we don't have birthright citizenship, there's estimated to be about 80,000 children now who are born in the UK who actually technically are illegal, who have no right to residence and who have no citizenship. But I think one of the things that's interesting in the Dutch case is also the ways that certain ideas of the family are mobilized in order to exclude people. So I don't know if anyone's read some very interesting work by Sarah van Walsum, who's kind of traced the ideal of the Dutch family since the 1950s and how this has changed and how it's been reflected in immigration processes and procedures. So that now the idea is that if you want to enter as a family, as a husband or a wife, then you must show that you are able to bring up good Dutch citizens. And so people are shown pictures of same-sex people kissing, and their response to that is monitored to see, well, you know, are you going to be able to bring up a tolerant citizen, or are we going to have to exclude you because actually you're intolerant and not living up to Dutch values? So I think that's very interesting also for what it tells us about the dual role of tolerance and how tolerance is used on the one hand to say, hey, we're so inclusive and multicultural, but is also an implicit threat. If you're not tolerant, if you're not as tolerant as we are, and the question of that we and that tolerance is actually up for grabs, then we can exclude you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. This is probably a bit outside of your, I guess, areas of expertise, but I think you'd have some good insight into it because you talked about the public narrative. With an influx of probably more educated public intellectuals on the conservative side, Kwasi Kwarteng and Rory Stewart, so Cambridge and Oxford educated intellectuals who regularly post things, and Kwarteng is against, he's one of the members of parliament that admitted about Britain's colonial past. Do you think that has changed the public narrative or will change in the upcoming years, considering that they're looked upon as young leaders of the next generation?
So these are progressive people who are calling, is that right?
Do you think because they have kind of different views? I mean, Rory Stewart wrote, I think, a Pulitzer-winning, prize-winning book, and Kwasi Kwarteng is his doctorate from Cambridge. Do you think that will help shift the public narrative away from kind of a reactionary right?
Well, I'd like to think so, but I don't know. I mean, I suppose I think, well, one thing is it's always good to have a historical, you know, to really have a kind of historical understanding of immigration, and that certainly in Britain has been sorely lacking. I think we have to think about how race and class play together here, though, because so on the one hand, I think that the debate around race and immigration, I'm talking from a British perspective, but I suspect there might be things to be learned from this, is that there's been a big kind of thing about, immigration controls are racist, and then government officials bending over backwards saying, no, they're not racist, it's just a coincidence that everyone in detention is black, but that's neither here nor there. So, but actually, what people will never say is that immigration controls are designed, what they won't deny is that immigration controls are designed to keep out the poor. So they'll deny that they're designed to keep out black people, but they won't deny that they're designed to keep out the poor, because actually that is a good immigration system, let in the rich and keep out the poor. And I think that shows that we need to think about how race and class work together, and that actually they've always been linked, and that race is more than just about the colour of your skin. And in some ways I think that on the right, they play this a bit, they can play this much better, so that my hunch would be, if this was in the UK, that the response to that from the right and from the sort of populist right as well would be like, yeah, what do these guys know? You know, Oxford, Cambridge, you know, they've never done a decent day's work in their life. They're not the person whose job's being taken, and so on and so forth. So I think that, and you can also, in a way it's part of what I mean about the rose-tinted spectacles. You can also get sort of, as we have in the UK, people sort of, people with very reactionary pedigrees who suddenly start caring about the white working class when it comes to immigration. They've never cared about them before, but suddenly matters of class get put on the agenda. And I think actually that's the only time in Britain anyway that we ever talk about class now, is when it comes to immigration. It's suddenly the main thing, it's the problem for the white working class. And interestingly, I think also you have while on the right will suddenly care about class, the left suddenly start talking about efficiency and profit and hard work and things that they're sort of using terms that normally they're not particularly comfortable with. So there's a kind of funny switch, and it's that switch, I think, which might make it quite difficult, which isn't to say one shouldn't try, but might make it difficult on their own for people to be able to achieve things. What really achieves things, after all, is, I would say, organising and education alongside people who are prepared to kind of stand up in Parliament and take some flack. You need both, I would say.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that. Was there another person at the back? Was that you? Were we running to the microphone? So, okay, sorry. My question is really, so most of your presentation was really normative and discursive, and it speaks about, these different categories and how they might relate, or how we're kind of asked to have them relate to each other, and how you're shifting the focus. And you speak a little bit about the political implications of the kinds of alliances that we might build, given linking the migrant and the failed citizen. But I guess I'm interested in the kind of research agenda that you would see for migration studies or for international migration scholars, given this push to link these categories as a way to move forward, right? So if we're building a research agenda, not just political alliances, but sort of as academic researchers, saying what kind of studies should we be doing to push to reconnect those categories, right? So thanks.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I hadn't really thought about. But I think that, okay, so I suppose one thing I would say is that it must be, I would say, a research agenda that is properly actually rooted in history, I would say. So that, for example, we understand, we see how the vagrant and the vagabond and the valiant beggar that sort of were the sort of forces that pose such a problem for social cohesion in the kind of 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, now are sort of being replaced by the migrant, I think we have to start, and this is not a new thing to say, but I still think we haven't managed to do it, which is to move away from methodological nationalism, from assuming the category of the nation state, and see the work that that nation state does, even in forming the category of the migrant. And I think that's the challenge for all of us who are kind of interested, whether sort of intellectually or as activists, and working with that category, is actually, in the end, it's a category that's made by something which is ultimately, I would say, a problem. So I suppose that would be the beginnings of the research agenda, which is to see, so when does being a migrant matter and when doesn't it matter? And because I think a lot of the time we think it matters more than actually it does, both in kind of political practice but also in our research. So I suppose that's the very beginnings of an answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to add that in addition to the historical perspective, and that was a very good comment, maybe a geographical perspective would also be very valuable.